Hi everyone, Mrs. Thorson again for regular government. Or Argo, sorry. We are going to move on to the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention. So, spoiler alert, we won the American Revolution. We tried to do the Articles of Confederation, they just weren't working. They literally called themselves the League of Friendship. So when you put your first piece of information about the country, your first document that sets up the government for their country, the League of Friendship, which is practically something you see in My Little Pony, you're doomed for failure. So they basically realized they got to do something else. So we're going to look at them framing the Constitution. All right. So on September 11, 1786, James Madison was like, listen, we got to meet to fix this thing because these Articles of Confederation, our League of Friendship ain't working. And so he said, let's meet up in Annapolis. And no one showed up to his party, poor thing. 5 people showed up, 12 people showed up. It was quite sad. No one was meeting. He's like, all right, listen, since no one showed up to my party, I really need this to happen. So maybe we could try for next May. And if we do it then, more people can have time to get their plans in line and everything like that. And that's when they really decided, let's have that. So they did meet up in Philadelphia in May at the Pennsylvania State House, which is now called Independence Hall, because that's also where the Declaration of Independence was signed. And people actually showed up. So James Madison's party was a little bit more successful this time. So the people who created the Constitution were known as the framers. The framers were the ones that framed or created the Constitution. And who was the one that was really in charge? James Madison. He's known as the father of the Constitution. That dude wrote and wrote and wrote and came up with the vast majority of the ideas. So at the beginning, they're like, who do we pick? Who do we choose to be the president of the convention? Everyone's like, dude, you got to pick G-dubs. You got to pick George Washington. He's kind of the best. So they picked him. It was unanimous. Everybody was like, yeah, let's definitely do it. He's the guy. So why? Why him? Well, number one, people knew who he was. And he's a war hero. Americans loved him. So when we are basically falling apart, we've been a country for about 10 minutes. And when our first form of government, the Articles of Confederation, do not work, they're awful. The League of Friendship is falling apart. They need someone who people can trust. The Articles of Confederation, there wasn't a president, there wasn't a Supreme Court. It was just the legislative branch, and they didn't even do anything. Their one job was to declare war if we needed it. And they're like, this is terrible. We need something bigger. And they knew Washington. Everybody loved Washington. So that was their choice. So the first thing they decided was, how do we make a legislative branch? They wanted to make a national government that would be a little bit more powerful than the sad League of Friendship. So they decided, let's make the legislative branch first because we want a representative government, and that represents the people the best. So they came up with some ideas. Now, the people from Virginia and big states loved what was known as the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan said, let's have a bicameral legislature. So the word bi means two, just like you'd see in a bicycle or something. And so 2 houses. And the representation would be based on population. So big states love this because, of course, they would get more people in Congress. Now, the small states were like, dude, I don't like that. That's not cool for us. So they came up with the idea of the New Jersey Plan. So William Patterson came up with this idea. He said we should just have one house, a unicameral legislature, and every state, let's have it be equal. Everybody should be equal. So we have the states like New Jersey, which is small, have the exact same amount of people as New York, which is the biggest state in the union. So obviously, the big states and the small states were clashing over that. So the Pee Wee Herman word of the day is compromise. That's what this whole convention was about. Creating the Constitution was a lot of compromises. And Roger Sherman came up and he's like, I got you guys. Let's have a compromise. He called it, whoops. Where did that go? Hang on. Sorry about that. That was weird. He called it the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise because that's where he's from. He's like, why don't you combine your 2 plans together? have the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan combined. So you can have a bicameral legislature and have one house where the representation is based on population and one house where it's equal. So that's how we got the House and the Senate, because the House is based on population. Illinois has 18 members, where California has 53, where Wyoming has 1. And then the Senate will have equal representation, 2 per state. So it doesn't matter if you're the biggest state in the union like California or the smallest state like Wyoming, each state has 2. And then that's fair for the big and the small states. The next idea was, what do we do for slaves? So that was part of the original Constitution too. They came up with another compromise known as the 3/5 compromise, because the South was like, well, they should count towards the population. And the North was like, no, because that's not fair for us. So they came up with the idea of the 3/5 compromise, that 3/5 of every enslaved person would be counted for taxes and for representation. So where did they come up with this arbitrary number of 3/5? Why not half? Well, at the time, they said, with their, science and all that technology, they knew what they were talking about, that one white man worked as hard as 3/5 of a black man. So a black man could only do 3/5 of the work of a white man. Okay, yeah. All right, that was absolutely awful and weird, but that's what they said. Another compromise they came up with was the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise, which they were trying to figure out how to kind of ease out of slavery. A lot of them didn't like slavery and wanted to get rid of it. But as Thomas Jefferson said, it's like holding a wolf by the ears. You don't want to hold it, but you don't dare let it go. So that was kind of their ideology. It's like they didn't want it, but they were worried about getting rid of it. So they were trying to ease their way out of it. So one way they were doing that is getting rid of international slave trade after 1808. Was there slave trade in the country after 1808? Yes, but not international, legal international. It also gave Congress the right to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Commerce is trade. So they're regulating trade between states and trade with other countries. And it forbid Congress to tax exports. So if you ever wanted to sell something to another country, they cannot tax that. And that still exists today. So they made these compromises. They decided to have a president. They decided to have a Supreme Court. And they needed this to be approved. Now, at the time, the only part of the Constitution that existed was the preamble and the articles, which the articles just set up the branches and set up how the government's going to be run. There's no amendments in it whatsoever, because an amendment means to change it. So they're not going to change it when it's the original version. People loved it and people hated it. The people that loved it were the Federalists. They said, we should pass this. This is great. The central government needs to be strong so we can be a united country. And the Anti-Federalists were like, no. This takes away your rights. I don't like it. The state and local governments should be the ones in charge. So there were 2 opposing groups that were trying to convince the state legislatures not to pass this thing. But it did. Why? Because they compromised. Of course they compromised. So they got it ratified because the Anti-Federalists were like, listen, we'll sign this thing and we'll pass it, but you need to add a